4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues. During World War II, the Nazi doctors used the Jews that were being held prisoners in concentration camps as experiments. Nazi doctors violated the trust placed in them by humanity and forced the Jews against their will to become subjects of the investigations. They carried out experiments such as freezing experiments, head injury experiments, malaria experiments, high altitude experiments, etc. Figure 3 is a photo of a prisoner being submerged under freezing icy water, and this was conducted so that the Nazis could see at what temperature would these subjects become unconscious or even die. This particular freezing experiment was carried out to simulate the conditions the army suffered on the Eastern Front, as the Germans were not prepared for the cold. Therefore, many German soldiers died of freezing. The Jews were not volunteers and were forced into doing these experiments, and clearly all of the subjects did not give their consent for this to take place on them, and they were not allowed to withdraw. This was all illegal, as the Nazis did not follow the correct procedures when they carried out the experiments. This would cause physical and psychological harm to the subjects, that's if they survived, because it was a traumatic process for them. So, if they didn't give their consent, this is unethical, because you should be allowed to remove yourself from the experiment and have the right to withdraw if you do feel uncomfortable. But as these photos show, these subjects did not have the option to do so, which would lead to, as it's illegal, it would lead to either imprisonment or suspension from their job, but most likely imprisonment at this kind of point in time. Another theory was the Milgram experiment. So in 1963, Milgram conducted an experiment that focused on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. Volunteers were recruited for a lab experiment, and these people were the learners. So these volunteers were known as learners, and these learners were issued an electric shock by the teacher every time they made a mistake in their test. And the test was just to remember the pairs of words, and the teacher would then test them after they had done their almost studying time, and then it would be like a quiz. So these volunteers were told they were going to get an electric shock, but were not told the amount of voltage. And so this was a form of omission through deception, because they weren't told how high the voltage was. They didn't know what harm they would cause to them. And the leaders of the experiment gave them the shocks anyway, and they weren't allowed to withdraw, which in time would cause them harm. And because they're getting shocked, they would get like psychological / emotional harm, and obviously physical harm, because their bodies would be getting damaged and shocked. But they did give their consent for this to happen, but because they didn't know what harm they would come to, they gave their consent because they didn't think it would be that bad. But this was unethical, because obviously they weren't allowed to withdraw from it. The teachers did say you have to continue with the experiment for as long as it goes on, and forever how long the shocks go up to, which I think it was quite high voltage. I think it was definitely higher than 400 volts. The second one is the Zimbardo experiment, and in 1973 Zimbardo wanted to find out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards or had to do with the prison environment. So to study the roles people play in the prison situations, Zimbardo converted a basement of the Stanford University Psychology building into a mock prison. He advertised asking for volunteers to participate in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. The study comprised 24 male college students, which were chosen from 75 volunteers, and they were also paid $15 per day to take part in the experiment. But at the end of this experiment, most of the subjects were distressed because they had experienced physical and emotional harm, and this was unethical because it was a kind of form of abuse to them. And they weren't allowed to withdraw, so they weren't allowed to just walk out of the prison. They had to stay there for as long as the experiment was over, like the Milgram experiment. And obviously, they gave their consent, but they didn't know exactly what was going to happen. They didn't know that they would be kept in the prison and that they would end up eventually being abused by the guards, and like their breads were taken away at one point because the prisons began to rebel, so the guards took their beds away. Again, this was a form of deception through omission, because they were not going not told that they were going to get abused, and they didn't fully understand the hazards and the process of the experiment. So BASE stands for the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. This is the professional body for sport and exercise in the UK, and it was researchers. However, if researchers do not follow the correct procedure when carrying out an investigation, they can lose their accreditation and be put forward for ethical training. So BASE produces a code of conduct for sport and exercise science researchers. Some ethical and legal issues need to be considered when a scientist wishes to carry out an experiment or investigation, and it needs to be cleared by the ethics committee. And these ethical and legal issues link in with the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which were 10 kind of pointers that needed to be considered when carrying out an investigation. These participants should give conformed consent, so all of the hazards of the experiment investigations should be outlined, and they should be told what the subject matter is. Number 2 is the experiment should have a purpose, so it shouldn't be random, it just shouldn't be kind of a spur of the moment thing, it did have to have a scientific purpose to it. The experiment should be designed and based on results from an animal experimentation. The experiment should avoid unnecessary harm, physical or mental injury and suffering, so this shouldn't include any kind of physical, mental, like psychological and emotional harm to it. Number 5 was the experiment should not go ahead of potential harm as a cause for concern. And number 6 was risk assessments should be carried out, so obviously to do with health and safety and like the equipment. Number 7 was preparations needed to be made, i.e. the facilities provided were provided to protect subject from harm. And the number 8 was experiments, so there should be a conducted qualified person that was carrying out the investigation. It shouldn't just be someone random carrying this out. It should actually be someone who is qualified and knows what they're doing. And during the experiment, participants were allowed to stop the experiment at any time, and also the scientists in charge should be prepared to stop this experiment at any point. So they should not force the participant to carry on with the experiment if they don't want to, if they feel uncomfortable. It should be something that is a choice and can be stopped. So for BASES, there were ethical issues and legal issues, which were 1, informed consent, 2, right to withdraw, 3, confidentiality and anonymity, I think. So like it should be anonymous. 4, competence, 5, professional conduct and responsibilities, 6, health and safety, risk and benefit analysis. So there should be more benefits to risks in the investigation. Volunteers should be kind of advertised, and volunteers should be could choose to do it. They shouldn't be forced upon them. Health medical screening questionnaires, so PARQs, and a participant disclaimer to say that they do understand what the investigation actually does entail. The key terms for this was ethical, so it's relating to beliefs about what is morally right and wrong, and I found this in the Cambridge Dictionary. This is their kind of meaning of what ethical is. Moral principles of decent human conduct, and no emotional physical harm, so someone shouldn't be purposely harmed or abused in any way. And also there's a last one that should be data protection, so if the researcher says it's anonymous and it is going to be protected by data, then that is how it should be, and they shouldn't go against their word, otherwise this would be considered illegal. So for legal, they have to be working within the boundaries of civil law. So if they say they're gonna if they say they're going to stop the experiment, but like they had that choice and the participant chooses to do so, but the researcher still continues to put them through that pain, then that is illegal because it is unethical and it is not the appropriate way to go about it. So my first scenario was an investigation of the recovery time from a maximum intensity gymnastics routine using ice baths. Participants signed a document that said they were to be monitored at all times. However, the researcher does not always stay in the room, and most of the gymnasts didn't understand what the experiment entailed. So this was the good thing in this scenario was that the fact that there was volunteers, that the gymnasts were from a class, but they were volunteers, so they weren't forced to do it. and to sit in the ice baths. And also the experiment was reviewed by the ethics committee, so they did get approval, so it was considered safe, and it did have a purpose. However, oh, and also for a good thing, there was scientific misconduct, expertise, and reputation. So the coach was a qualified gymnastics coach, and it wasn't someone that just said they were qualified. And also, that would have been shown up in the ethics committee. If it wasn't if they weren't qualified, they wouldn't have approved the research investigation. But the bad thing was that there was confidentiality and anonymous issues, which would have linked, which is so the participants did sign a document to say that it would be monitored at all times. However, the researcher does not always stay in the room, which is a kind of risk assessment factor as well, because it is a safety factor, as obviously if something does go wrong, only the researcher really knows. Obviously he's qualified, so only the researcher does know what is going to happen to that experiment, and obviously they're not really allowed to be meant to be. If they say that they're going to be in the room, they should be in the room. Otherwise, this could cause their BASIS accreditation to be lost, or maybe a suspension or a fine or a prison sentence. Anything that will really, and they maybe like lose their job. So it just could affect their overall career. So going back to the confidentiality issue. It obviously is an investigation, so the data from the gymnasts would be said to be confidential, but they signed a document, but it didn't include saying that it would be confidential. So the researchers have kind of chosen to not use the confidentiality and kind of exploit the gymnast data, which some of them might be comfortable with and some of them might not be, but they should have been given the choice to say whether they want it to be confidential or not. And obviously this could be emotional harm as well, because they might get quite distressed or just like upset that they have been exploited, their results have been exploited, because some might feel embarrassed that they didn't stay in the ice bath for as long as the others. The fact that they have got an ice bath, it wasn't said what temperature it would be. So a bit like the Milgram experiment, the gymnasts went into the experiment thinking it would not be that cold, but in fact it was freezing. So this could have led to physical pain and harm, because it was a maximum intensity routine. However, the ice baths were very cold. And so obviously that's a form of deception, because they weren't told how cold they were, and that could obviously lead to imprisonment, because they were decepting their participants. Obviously physical harm, emotional harm, they might be scarred from it, and their BASIS accreditation could be taken away from them. The second scenario is a study of the different abilities in a training session for young British gymnasts. When some of the gymnasts made mistakes, their coaches laughed and showed them up in front of the class. One girl in the class landed awkwardly on her ankle and was experiencing severe discomfort, but was told she could not quit until they had completed their training class. So a good thing about this was that there was a health and medical screening questionnaire done, which obviously is a good thing, because they need to know who has injuries or medical issues such as asthma. Obviously gymnastics is quite a physical, like cardiovascular kind of based sport from when they're running up and down. Obviously muscular endurance as well. If they strain a muscle, it could be quite potential and they could get sued. There was data protection in this one, however, so students were given that confidentiality and able to be kept kind of like a secret and know that their results weren't shared with anyone.